Hail and welcome. Paul here, and this is my second lecture for my online course on Dark Age Britain. Now, in my last lecture, we talked about the 5th century and the coming of the Anglo-Saxons, how they crossed the North Sea from Germany to Britain and to carve out the land that would come to be known as England, and how they pushed the native Britons to the west into the land that would become known as Wales. We talked about the battles of King Arthur, as well as Isle of Sussex and Hengist and Horsa. In this lecture, we are going to talk about the 6th century, when the Anglo-Saxons began to truly settle and their kingdoms began to rise to prominence, eventually leading to their conversion to Christianity. So throughout this century, we see the establishment of what would become known as the heptarchy, the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Now, before I name the kingdoms, I would like to clarify that the term Anglo-Saxon comes from the merging of 2 tribes, the Angles and the Saxons. And then you also had a tribe called the Jutes, which were supposedly what Hengist and Horsa were, who I spoke of in my last lecture. Now, the Jutes weren't significant enough to be part of the merged name, which would have been a mouthful anyways, the Anglo-Sax Jutes, or the Anglo-Jute Saxons. No, the Anglo-Saxons rolls off the tongue better. Regardless, the Jutes ruled in the kingdom of Kent, and they also controlled the Isle of Wight. The Saxons ruled in the kingdoms of Wessex, the West Saxons, Essex, the East Saxons, and Sussex, the South Saxons. The Angles ruled in the kingdoms of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. Now, technically, Northumbria was a super kingdom divided into 2 separate kingdoms, Dalriada and Bernicia, but I'll talk more about that in my next lecture on the 7th century. There was also a small kingdom in the Northeast Midlands called Lindsey, but that kingdom would be absorbed into the greater Midland kingdom of Mercia. So those are the 7 kingdoms: the Anglian kingdoms of East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, the Saxon kingdoms of Wessex, Essex, and Sussex, and the Jutish kingdom of Kent. These 7 kingdoms formed what was called the heptarchy. There was no single England at the time. You had these 7 kingdoms that were either at war with each other or forging alliances, or they were fighting against the native Britons in the west. These were what we would now call the English kingdoms, but you had no unified England. You had no King of England or King of the English yet. However, what you did have throughout the course of the Anglo-Saxon period was kings who would establish themselves as Bretwalda, or over-king of the Saxon kingdoms, the emperor of Saxon Britain, so to speak. So what about the native Celtic Britons? What happened to them? In my last lecture, we talked about the battles between the Saxons and the Britons. What happened to the Britons? Well, they still prospered in the west, in what would become known as Wales, and also Cornwall, and a few kingdoms in what is now southwestern Scotland and northwestern England. Now, I am sure that you can figure out that the term England derives from the Angles. It means Angle land, the land of the Angles. The term Wales also has an interesting history. It comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for stranger or foreigner. So the Anglo-Saxons came to their island and called them the foreigners, to the point where it literally became the name of their land. But just as a single nation called England would come much later, so would a single nation called Wales. Like the Anglo-Saxons, the Welsh had multiple kingdoms, such as Gwynedd, Powys, Dyfed, and Gwent. You also had, in the southwest of Britain, south of what is now Wales, a kingdom called Dumnonia, that had existed for many centuries before the Anglo-Saxons during the Roman period. Much of Dumnonia would be taken over by the West Saxons, but the part that the native Britons were able to retain would come to be known as Cornwall. which takes the name of the tribe there, the Cornovi, and adds Wales at the end. So it means Wales of the Cornovi Wales. Be called Kurnow by the Britons there, and the Saxons would call it West Wales. In the north, you had the Brythonic kingdoms of the Old North, or the Hen Ogledd, the kingdoms of Strathclyde, Gododin, Reged, and Elmet. These kingdoms would eventually just be absorbed by the Anglo-Saxons and also the Scots. So it wasn't just Anglo-Saxons and Britons in Britain. You also had the Scots and the Picts. The Picts were the blue-painted wild barbarians, and they lived in the far north, and they were a huge problem to the Romans during the time that they ruled Britain, which is why they built a wall to keep them out called Hadrian's Wall. The Scots originally came from Ireland and sailed over to create the kingdom of Dalriada in the southwest of Pictland. So those are the four peoples of Britain. Bede says it in his History of the English People. You have the Anglo-Saxons, the English, the Britons, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Picts. It is also important to note that the native Britons didn't just establish kingdoms in western Britain. There were also a handful who crossed the English Channel into modern-day France, or Gaul as it was called back then. And they formed the Kingdom of Armorica, which included the peninsula called Brittany. So for those of you who are familiar with Brittany, France, now you know why it's called that. Because it actually was like a little piece of Celtic Britain in France. But back to Britain now, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were becoming very powerful in the 6th century in every way. Militarily and monetarily through trade from the continent. The Anglo-Saxons were beginning to really establish themselves as the top dogs on the island of Britain. But there was one thing that made them unique for the time, and that is the fact that they were not Christian. They were pagan. At the time, Christianity was spreading rapidly. On the continent, the Germanic tribe, the Franks, who had taken over large portions of Gaul, had converted to Roman Catholicism under King Clovis. The Goths and the Vandals, who took over Spain and North Africa, practiced Arian Christianity, which the Catholic Church saw as a heretic form of Christianity, but still was Christianity. And in the British Isles, the Britons had been largely Christian since the time of Constantine, even some having converted before that. The Irish were converted to Christianity by a Briton we all know named St. Patrick in the earlier half of the 5th century. And then the Northern Irish Scots came over to Britain and created the kingdom of Dalriada. The Picts were still pagan and would be converted by a Dalriadan saint named Columba around the same time that the Anglo-Saxon conversion. But the Picts were a bunch of mountain barbarians. The fact that the Anglo-Saxons seemed to rule the island of Britain with an iron fist and ruled as pagans and not Christians made them unique. However, the Catholic Church saw this as something that needed to be changed, obviously. So before I talk about their conversion, let's take a moment to talk about the pagan beliefs of the Anglo-Saxons. First of all, if you're familiar at all with Norse mythology and the paganism that the Vikings followed, it is pretty much the exact same. Just like how Greek and Roman mythology parallel each other, so does Norse and Anglo-Saxon mythology. They believed in many of the same gods under different but similar names. You had Woden, which in Norse is Odin. You had Thunor, which in Norse is Thor. You had Tyr, in Norse is Tyr. and Frigg, which in Norse is Frigga. These gods would lend themselves to the English days of the week, and for that matter, the Dutch, German, and Scandinavian days of the week as well. Yeah, Tuesday is Tuesday. Wednesday is Woden's Day. Thursday is Thunor's Day. And Friday is Frigg's Day. They also had a strong connection to fate, which they called weird. They believed in 3 female spiritual entities that are known in Norse as the Norns, who spin the fate of mankind into a web or a tapestry. The weavers of fate, or the weavers of weird. They also believed in a number of supernatural beings who inhabited the landscape, elves and land wights. These are beings that can either be helpful or malicious. They can either bring forth bounty or fertility, or they can shoot you with arrows that spread sickness. They were also big on herbalism and had many herb charms, so their magic went hand in hand with medicine. But the Anglo-Saxons were a people who believed in heroic gods, the power of fate, and the magic of nature. But Christianity would make its way into their culture very soon. Now, what's really interesting is the fact that the Welsh already were Christians, and yet they never bothered preaching to the Anglo-Saxons. In fact, some sources make it seem like the Welsh flat out refused to preach to the English because they hated them so much that they probably preferred that they burn in hell. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons came from 2 places. The Scots and Irish preached in the north, spreading Celtic Christianity, a more primitive form of Christianity, which I will talk more about in my next lecture. In southern England, however, it was mostly French and Italian missionaries being sent up by the Pope himself. And here's how it happened. And if you like wordplay, you will find this story amusing. So sometime in the 590s, Pope Gregory noticed 2 young Anglo-Saxon slave boys being sold in a market in Rome. Now, the Pope was not familiar with the cherubic facial features that the English are known for. Blue eyes, sandy hair, round cheeks. He asked what manner of men these slaves were, and he was told that they were Angles, to which he replied, "Not Angles, but angels." He then asked what kingdom they came from. The kingdom of Dalriada, which is the southern subkingdom of Northumbria, the kingdom of Dalriada. He then interpreted that he needed to save them de ira, which is Latin for from wrath. He then asked who their king was. King Aella, to which the Pope replied, "Alleluia shall be sung in that land." So he sent missionaries to England to go force his religion on everyone. How fitting. Now, the thing I often wonder is whether the Pope actually thought they were angelic enough to try to free them from slavery, or if he just thought, I need to go force my religion where they came from. Regardless, it was for the most part a peaceful conversion, unlike what happened in the Frankish Empire in the 8th century. Mostly just missionaries and preachers preaching to kings and their nobles. From what we know, this conversion was not done through violence, from what we know. This was the Canterbury mission. First, St. Augustine converted King Ethelbert of Kent, and Canterbury became the religious capital of England, with the Archbishopric of Canterbury still being in office to this day. Now, King Ethelbert was a very powerful king. Part of this had to do with his ties to the continent. Now think about where Kent is. It is right near the English Channel, the sea channel between England and France. Because of this, much of the trade from the continent would be sent up through Kent. He was also married to a Frankish princess named Bertha. Ethelbert was one of those Bretwaldas I was talking about, an overlord of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Now, as powerful as Ethelbert was as a Bretwalda, he wasn't necessarily powerful enough to influence all the other kings to convert to Christianity. That would come gradually throughout the course of the 7th century, but it all started here. Now, the most fascinating thing about Anglo-Saxon Christianity is that the earliest converts still retained their Germanic warrior culture, simply applying Christianity to it. Many did not even give up their nature of polytheism, simply placing Jesus alongside Woden and Thunor. They also saw Christ as a warrior god who defeated death, not as a weak sacrificial lamb. This is exemplified in the poem The Dream of the Rood, the Rood Tree, which also shows their connection to the natural world, as the poem mostly revolves around the tree that was cut to make the cross. Otherworldly beings from their pagan lore, such as elves, goblins, and giants, were also tied into Christianity. They became malicious spirits descended from Cain in the story of Cain and Abel. This is flat out said in the story of Beowulf, as the monster Grendel too is descended from Cain. On kin of Cain was the killing avenged by sovereign God for slaughtered Abel. Ill fared his feud, and far was he driven for the slaughter's sake from sight of men. Of Cain awoke all that woeful breed, Ettins and elves and evil spirits, as well as the giants that warred with God weary while. So the Anglo-Saxons were really tied to the story of Cain and Abel because it was a story about kin slaying, something that would have been highly frowned upon. Besides the fact that it was just dishonorable and bad-witted, the Anglo-Saxons also had the system of weregild, a blood price, or a killing fine, if you will. Like a fine you would pay for murder. If you kill somebody, you were required to pay that person's family a weregild. Now, since you couldn't pay your own family their own money, kinslaying was considered probably the lowest thing you can do. So it made sense that Cain would be the ancestor of all the scary monsters that dwelled in the woods at night. So let's talk about Beowulf for a moment here. We are all familiar with that story, I am sure. Why is it so important? Well, it's a reflection of the Anglo-Saxons' pagan past, but it is written as a Christian story, and it is full of these pagan elements. Now, we can imagine that at one point Beowulf existed purely as a pagan story, but pagans didn't know how to read or write, so it took Christianity for the story to be actually written down. And when it was written down, it was written through a Christian filter. But it shows how little the Anglo-Saxons actually changed after converting to Christianity. Still telling stories about heroes slaying monsters with magic swords. They were simply just following a new god. It is also not unlikely that early on, Christianity was not strictly enforced. Kings and nobles may have been converted, and there would have been churches and preachers everywhere, but many of the common people, many warriors even, could have still been pagan. Paganism just kind of fizzled away throughout the 8th century as England became closer and closer with the church on the continent. So, let's talk about one of the questions that was asked during the lecture. We were asked to elaborate on the kingdom of Dalriada, or Dalriada. This was a Gaelic kingdom. This was pretty much where the Scots came from. Now, the Scots were originally Irish. They were from Northern Ireland in the kingdom of Ulster. They migrated over to Pict land and carved out this small kingdom in what is now Argyll. You know, all the islands on the southwestern Scotland. It might have started off as a pagan kingdom. We're not sure. We're nothing about that, but it's more known for the Christian monks there who built the monastery of Iona. We'll see a lot more about Dalriada in my next lecture on the 7th century. So eventually the Dalriadan Scots would expand further and further throughout Pictland, and these Scots would merge with the Picts and would become the race of the Scottish, if you will. So that concludes my lecture on the 6th century. In my next lecture on the 7th, we will further discuss the spread of Christianity, the conflict between Celtic Christianity in the north and Roman Christianity in the south, and we will also be talking about that last pagan king of the Anglo-Saxons, Penda of Mercia. See you next time.